Hi, my name is Kia Johnston, and I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley in Egyptology. And today I am going to show you how an elite ancient Egyptian might have been wrapped after being embalmed after their death. Embalming and the subsequent wrapping was very important to the ancient Egyptians because they had this idea that when you die, your souls, the different components of your soul kind of came apart and they needed to be reunited. And the purpose of the mummification and the wrapping was kind of to protect the body and protect the limbs and to kind of ritually reunite these different parts of your personhood. The other idea was that part of your soul, which was called the Ba, and it was usually depicted as a bird with a human head, would go forth from the tomb by day and to be amongst the living and be with the sun god as he sailed across the sky in the boat. And at night, the Ba would come back to the body and would kind of be rejuvenated by the body. And so this body needed to be preserved as a potential home for this part of the soul called the Ba. So I'm going to demonstrate this on our deceased, who is really a skeleton, which I purchased for Halloween. And without further ado, here goes. Our client here obviously opted for the cheaper kind of mummification since he's just a skeleton. But most of the instructions for how to wrap a body, and there are a couple of them out there, start with wrapping the head. So here we start with a piece of cloth behind the head. And wrap that cloth over the head and tuck it in around the sides. The limbs are wrapped using shorter bandages than the ones we will use later. I did some back of the napkin calculations and divided all of the heights and widths in the unwrapping description by 4, and hopefully this will be about to scale for this tiny skeleton. The report that I'm following that describes the unwrapping of this body talks about a woman who would have been mummified according to the standards of the 21st dynasty when they did a lot of underskin stuffing to make the mummy look very lifelike. And so she would have had a substantial abdomen. So I've actually made this skeleton an abdomen so that I have something to wrap other than just a spine. And here we are wrapping the abdomen and then the thorax, just in circular bandages. Then the arms are wrapped individually, and crisscrossing bandages are added to cover up the shoulders and again on the hips. And then another spiral bandage is added around the legs to kind of flesh out the legs a little bit. And then finally, a layer of sawdust is sprinkled over the chest. I haven't added much here. And I'm not really sure why they needed the sawdust on the chest. The next part is interesting because it involves this really long, big sheet which has been cut up to have tails on both ends. And it's going to be used to wrap the body vertically. It's actually pretty complicated wrapping because it gets folded in half around the body. 2 of the bottom tails get tied up around the neck going through the legs, and the other 2 get wrapped around the legs like a tube, and then we use spiral bandages to wrap around them and secure them in place later. And I thought about the reasons they might have had for doing this complicated bandage, and it struck me that at this point in time, the organs would have been reintroduced to the body, so this sort of vertical wrapping kind of isolates them and gives them an extra layer of protection. And it also, if they've done any sort of stuffing through the anus or the vagina, it can keep that in place as well. This bandage is also kind of complicated. It starts behind the shoulders and then comes down either arm. And it'll be used to make a little vertical tube around the arms, which gets secured by spiral bandages, but the ends of that tube will be used to tie the arms in place over the crotch area. So then these long tails of the arms get wrapped back up around the forearms and the elbows and tied around the chest area. And so they go to this great length to get these arms secured in place. The next step is to place the papyrus between the legs, and here I've kind of tied the legs together to be a little more shapely. This was my initiative. And this papyrus is usually the Amduat, which is kind of a guide to the sun's journey through the underworld at night. Or it can be an enumeration of the forms of the sun god. And at this point, we're done wrapping the individual limbs, and the body will get wrapped as a whole. using a combination of spiral and figure eight bandages. And if you're wondering where all of this linen is coming from, that's a good question because it would have been very expensive. Most of it is being provided by the family, but it also may have been provided by the institution where the person worked. It consists of old clothes, and if the person is very lucky and they have a good position, it might also consist of clothing that was used to wrap the statue of the gods. Here you can see I've added a little bit of padding on the abdomen, and I was a bit surprised because for this body, most of the padding was actually on the front and on the legs as compared to on the sharp curvature of the behind and the back of the knees. But when I thought about this, it made a lot of sense because what they're trying to do here is create this image of a Sa, or an ideal mummified, divinized being. And so they're trying to kind of make the front a little plump, and they leave the natural curvature of the back. Here you can see our bundle is just starting to get more and more expansive and substantial. And I've added a little bit more padding in fronts of the tops of the legs, again, to kind of make that just an even curve at the front. This woman had two amulets inserted in her wrappings towards the end of her wrapping, and these consisted of a falcon made out of gold foil and a heart scarab, which was inscribed for somebody else entirely. The function of the heart scarab was to keep the heart from lying about a person's past misdeeds when they stood for judgment in the afterlife, but both the scarab and the falcon are symbols of solar rebirth. Here's another interesting wrapping, which is this vertical line that goes up over the face and then it gets wrapped around itself a few times at the top. And it forms a ridge that goes up the front of the face along the line of the nose. And the authors of the paper that I was reading have seen this on a few other bodies too, and they suspect that it forms kind of a protective frame around the face. It also might be to, again, create that idealized profile that I was mentioning earlier. Preserved bodies of the 21st dynasty and early 22nd often have these braces that are made out of leather and parchment, and they have the name of the reigning king or the high priest embossed on them. They're actually very good and used for dating of these burials, but we don't really know what they're for. But you'll notice that they do show up in this ideal divinized deceased, this image. They get immediately covered up by another crosswise bandage, followed by some more circular bandages at the shoulders and at the waists. Another feature of some of these 21st dynasty burials is that they get this shroud that has a picture of Osiris drawn on it in profile in red ink. This one had an inscription next to it, but the inscription was pseudo-hieroglyphs, so it didn't actually say anything. These might have actually been drawn by the priests as part of the ritual of wrapping. And now we get to the final layer, which is a big sheet that gets laid on over that Osiris shroud. It's actually tied around the back of the head at the top corners, but then it gets sewn on. The previous layers were not sewn on. They were simply wrapped and or helped along by the ritual application of resin. I was actually a little bit too lazy to sew the whole thing, so I glued it, but I started sewing it and you can see it here. It's sewed on the sides of the back and on the feet. I also think it's interesting that they weren't that concerned about how the back looked. It's this picture of the front and the side that they're really wanting. The final bandages are entirely decorative. And actually, they're more colorful than this. They consisted of a broad red band and a yellow band half its size. So all of these bands would have had a yellow stripe down the middle. I didn't have any yellow fabric, so we just went with red here. But you can also see how some coffin designs actually copy this pattern of these outer wrappings. So one more thing. The paper that I got the account of this unwrapping from is a paper called An Account of the Mummy of a Priestess of Amun, supposed to be Ta-Usert-Em-Suten-Pa by Grafton Elliot Smith. It was written in 1906, and like many works of that time, I feel it is not entirely respectful of this woman as a person, and so I thought it would be good in this just to tell you a little bit about her and what we know about her. According to Smith, she was a very short lady, and she had wavy brown hair with flecks of gray in it. She was probably around 40 years old at the time of her death. And we know that she probably lived in the reign, or at least died in the reign, of the high priest of Amun, Penujum II, in the 21st dynasty, which is around 950 BCE. She was a female clergy member of the Temple of Amun, and she was not buried with any of her own belongings, or at least all of the belongings that she was buried with have a different name on them. Her outer coffin is now in the British Museum, and her inner coffin, because a lot of these coffins got kind of mixed up after their discovery in the late 19th century, her outer coffin, we think, or I think, is actually in Brussels today. Her scarab and her amulets and her papyrus are still in Egypt. I haven't really been able to figure out a number for her papyrus yet. And as far as we know, her body is also still in Egypt, if indeed it still exists, although it was pretty devastated by this unwrapping process. And that is what we know about Ta-Usert-Em-Suten-Pa. There you have it. We have taken this plastic skeleton and we have transformed it into, well, if it were a real person, it would be the image of the divinized mummified deceased at this point. And if it had a soul, if it had a half bird, half human ba soul, that ba soul would be able to find its body and rejuvenate itself at night during the solar cycle and be reborn with the sun. Anyway, I hope you found this educational. Thank you very much for listening.